Hi, everyone. I'm Michael,
And I'm Andrew.
and we're teaching focused faculty at the University of Toronto, Mississauga.
Thank you so much for attending our presentation.
We'd like to revisit the idea of explicitly discussing and fostering revision in skills based and, in particular, STEM based courses.
So, to those of you who teach writing, this idea isn't new, right, or radical. Revision is well established as a key component of the writing process. It's understood that writing well requires more than just writing, that it requires planning, that it requires rewriting, and rewriting not only at the level of wording and typos, which we call editing, but also at the level of reconsidering the approach, right, the whole entire structure or argument. These larger scale changes are revisions, and they require critical reading skills. They also benefit from extensive feedback, both from peers and instructors. The process for programming is very similar. It's a writing process, though we often speak of it as a problem-solving process. After writing a first draft of the code, we evaluate it under various criteria: correctness, maintainability, adaptability, security, or other criteria, and then update it based on the evaluation. Some of these updates are small, comparable to editing, but others can force larger restructuring of the code on par with revision. It's important to emphasize that this process is what experts in programming do. In particular, the evaluation and revision of the code is an important step. Just having code written isn't good enough. And like the writing process, proper evaluation of code requires critical reading skills. Also, like the writing process, students, when unguided, tend to focus on the part they enjoy, the writing. They don't focus on the process, and they certainly don't do revision.
Now, the course we focus on is a first year introductory course, CS1, and it has between 800 and 1,200 students per semester. Students are interdisciplinary, with about half of them being interested in pursuing computer science as their primary program of study. The course itself has been flipped and is taught in an active learning classroom with both active and experiential learning in mind. So students are asked to participate, discuss, and write, while also having them code and do activities that they're trying to learn. Additionally, learning in this course is both supervised and unsupervised. Now, our course operates under the triple P model, and it's similar to the ISW's BOPS model. The first P in this instance is prepare, which allows students to watch us read and write code. Students will often also complete mini tasks that are targeting these learning objectives. The second P is practice, and this is where we synchronously work together in teams to read and write code. This is semi-supervised by teaching staff, so course instructors, teaching assistants. The third P is perform, which is where students work online to complete exercises with the ability to rapidly resubmit their work to receive feedback. So, for example, correctness and style. Further, in labs, students are able to apply their newfound knowledge and code writing skills under the supervision of TAs. Students are expected to independently apply the process with TAs available to provide feedback or support when needed. So, now that you know what our course looks like, how exactly does revision fit into it? CS1 provides numerous resources, including materials such as video modules, slides, exercises with solutions, and past midterms and exams. It has discussion board support as well as live support in labs and in office hours. Students are also provided with general design frameworks, problem solving techniques, and guidance on style. Now, this course is one which requires learners to use fundamentals and build off of them to solve more complex problems. CS1 is innately scaffolded, as is its material. So students are expected to regularly practice, keep up with the quick pace of the course. Further opportunities are given for students to reflect on their answers and improve upon them, whether that be revision of the approach or modification to the style or improvement with respect to correctness.
All right, so we've spoken a bit about what our course looks like, and now I want to talk about what revision looks like in our discipline and specifically in our course. So we explicitly discuss programming as a multi-step process that includes designing the solution, writing, and then evaluating and rewriting. So we use this idea of a design recipe to scaffold the process of designing and writing a function, and a function is a small piece of code, maybe akin to a paragraph. And this scaffold encourages students to describe what they want to do and to provide the means for evaluating their code after it's written. For example, the student would be asked to write a brief description of the purpose of the function in normal English, and then to articulate a number of inputs and the desired output of that function. You might also think about other criteria, but those first inputs and outputs then become tests, which we use to evaluate the functionality of the code. Despite this, our students do rush to write, and they focus primarily on the correctness of the code. And when they think of correctness, they're not thinking of how fitting with the style required by their team or fitting into other code that's been written. They're thinking about simple functional correctness, whether or not the function they're writing outputs what they think it should. So we spend a lot of time encouraging our students to evaluate and revise, both in class through modeling and out of class through resubmission of exercises. So revision within class, we focus on modeling process and providing feedback. And this is an intrinsically active step, and it requires that students be well prepared for the class. That is, the inverted structure that we've discussed earlier is very important for student success. They have to be ready. In a typical class meeting, we'll start by reviewing code. The instructor will pose 2 or 3 potential solutions to a problem. That problem will have been posed in the last class, and students will have volunteered their submissions for review. Then we'll spend time critiquing those problems. First, we'll ask the students to individually read the code and think about any questions they have about it, right? Concerns they have about it, aspects of the code that they think might be problematic or which they could be improved. Then we'll ask them to share those ideas in small groups. And then finally, we'll raise those ideas to the entire class. So why this structure? We're teaching classes of about 150 people at a time. And so we ask the students to work individually, then to share in a safe environment, and then to share to the entire class. Once we've looked at all of those pieces of code, then the instructor models revising and reevaluating one of them. So we'll take one of those pieces of code and we will refactor it, or we will redesign it, or we'll change, hopefully, large aspects of it to actually model revision, not just editing, but taking a different approach.
So all of the work that is turned in for this course has resubmission built in. For example, in the weekly exercises, which are intended to be formative, the students are given immediate automated feedback and are allowed as many submissions as necessary to get the full credit for the work. We use a number of tools to provide feedback on the structure and on the style of the code. Nevertheless, most of the feedback is, well, frankly, focused on functional correctness, and this may reinforce the student's own preference. Providing more in-depth automated feedback is an ongoing challenge for us. Now, with assignments, we have more time. The projects are larger, so there's an option to run a more complete and less automated set of evaluations to provide feedback. Originally, we employed a 24-hour resubmission policy, which meant that students were able to get their feedback within a reasonably quick amount of time post-deadline and then provide us with a new resubmitted version of their work. So they had this 24-hour window. However, we've moved away from this to try to provide feedback when students are in the learning mode. So while they're in that state of learning, as a result, we've been transitioning towards this idea of resubmission tokens, allowing students to submit their code for rapid feedback and number of times per hour. These checks provide correctness and style checking, but because of the time deadlines as before, they tend to focus more on the functional criteria such as correctness.
We've already mentioned the tendency of students to edit rather than to revise. And it's difficult to step away from a piece of code that you've just written and often struggled with, right? That code has required significant work. We've also noted how the immediate feedback that we've provided, both in the exercises and in the assignments under the token scheme, right, that immediate feedback by its nature tends to reinforce a focus on functionality. It's easy for us to test functionality. It's harder for us to test a broad range of other criteria. And furthermore, we have to prepare the students for all of those criteria that we're going to be assessing for. So what we're evaluating is whether or not the code, quote unquote, works, as opposed to evaluating how it works or how it fits into the larger project. So to get around the limitations of this immediate feedback, we rely on work in class. So I've already talked a little bit about how we review code, right, at the beginning of many class periods. So similarly, we will review code to emphasize non-functional criteria and to encourage students to make more substantive revisions to their code. For example, we might use peer feedback to get a range of viewpoints, where the instructor or TAs will specifically ask about more complex criteria to have the students think about it. For example, does this code adhere to our style guidelines and conventions? Which of these implementations is most efficient or would run most quickly under various inputs? Or even, is there a potential security threat in any of these pieces of code?
Now, here is a more detailed breakdown of how we normally operate our in-person active learning classrooms. We present a problem. Individual students jot down their ideas of how to solve it. Students work in their pods or their teams to come up with the best solution strategy. The pods then code a solution. The TAs will circulate to provide feedback and points to adjust that solution. Pods then rotate and provide feedback on the solution at their new stations. TAs will then record the solutions in comments, taking photos with their phone, for example. And then the instructor will select 3 to 5 solutions with different characteristics and perform a whole class code review, usually in the subsequent lecture. Now, due to COVID and deviation to online learning, we've moved away from this pods model to breakout rooms with some tweaks. For example, student engagement on problem solving within the breakout rooms was a huge issue this year. And because of this, we needed TAs to lead breakout room sessions. This was very different from student-run pods, but ultimately, our goal is for students to revise content and think about how to problem solve, which was effectively successful. Now, earlier we mentioned how often we start our classes with this idea of a peer-reviewed piece of code written by students. To get that code in the first place, we often use the room model, the process itself, and to provide peer feedback on early drafts.
Even with modeling done in class, some of our students develop what we call a Fixit mentality. They accept the feedback they get, and they resolve issues, but they don't critically evaluate their own code, nor do they build supports like test suites to provide their own feedback. This is partly an issue with our discipline. The students are influenced by industry, and they know that there are certain roles that are designated as development, and some are designated as test in industry. However, it's also a natural consequence of them just receiving lots of support on the evaluation. As new learners, we know the students don't know how to read critically, so they must be taught. And in the meantime, we invest significant resources in providing in-depth feedback, so some students naturally decide they don't need to provide that feedback themselves. So we explicitly fade these scaffolds as students become more comfortable with reviewing code for others. The goal is to encourage them to do this work for themselves, in addition to receiving feedback from peers. For example, later in the term, we ask students to write and submit test cases before writing the code to encourage them to run their own tests. We also provide less comprehensive feedback on assignments prior to the deadline, telling students that they are responsible for the evaluation of certain aspects of their code. This is an area of continuing work because of this tension in our practice between developing personal responsibility and working collaboratively within teams and relying on feedback from others. In this course, the focus is on personally developing programming skills. So while we use peer feedback, we tend to err on the side of personal responsibility for writing and revising the code.
Now, there's one final problem we want to raise: participation. As we mentioned earlier, students gravitate towards writing and are resistant to this idea of revision. In class meetings, our presence helps keep students on task. We can remind them to focus on the process. We can emphasize feedback provided by their peers, or we can suggest when code needs to be rewritten. But outside of the class, we largely rely on grade-based incentives. Students can see their scores improving as they respond to feedback and updating their code. This incentive focuses on the output, the code, rather than adherence to process, and is also limited by our ability to create automated feedback. In short, we can't assess everything we care about. This leads to problems with students gaming the system. For some highly achieving students, for example, this means deciding whether the work they have submitted is good enough. While the feedback we provide doesn't provide any final grades, the students often read between the lines to decide whether revising the work is actually worth it. As an aside, they also become quite upset when their guesses about their grades are later found to be incorrect. We also have trouble engaging some of our lower achieving students, as they saw the resubmission period as an automatic extension to the deadline. In some cases, they would turn in little to no work for feedback, meaning that they were opting out of the feedback and ultimately the revision cycle. These issues will be familiar to all of you. Grades are a crude instrument for motivating participation. This has fueled a large number of efforts to expand peer reviewing, as the idea that a person will look at code appears to increase accountability.
All right, let's wrap up. We've argued that the process that we're teaching in programming is akin to writing, so we can learn a great deal from people who study the writing process. In particular, in our course, it makes sense to focus on revision as it models an important process undertaken by experts in programming. It also allows us to see a number of issues, for example, avoidance of the process and a focus on editing rather than doing real revision, that are going to be familiar to writing instructors and where they have solutions and ideas for ameliorating those kinds of problems. So while our talk has been focused on our own introductory programming course, we see a number of places where these ideas could be used in our larger computer science discipline. In the second and third years, we discuss software engineering, and there we talk about program patterns or refactoring. In more theoretical courses, we are assessing the construction of logical arguments that are formalized into proofs. In the latter case, there could be opportunities to compare several different valid proofs of the same idea to contrast approaches. But in both of these examples, and in general in all of these cases, the students are being exposed to a process where they're creating an artifact, and where the students, in our experience, tend to focus on the output, on the artifact, and less on the process, which is what we care about. So explicitly exposing and scaffolding that process is important. So our question to you is, are these processes present in your own field? And where could you scaffold revision into your own courses?
Going forward, we need to emphasize that many others have made this call before us, so it's not novel. In our own field, there was a call to look at resubmission of work at least as far back as 2004. And we're confident that other STEM fields use revision too. We're hoping that our local call will inspire some of you to explore the idea of revision in STEM more broadly, inspired by the work on revision explored in writing, and with the goal of identifying common challenges and good practices for incorporating revision into all of our courses. In the Q&A period, we'd love to hear your ideas about where revision might fit into your disciplines. And if any of you are interested in evaluating the impact and student perception of particular resubmission practices, please do get in touch. Thank you.